Melissa Gilbert says she feels very excited today, not because a case is over, but because her husband is home while the legal process continues. This story is not about conclusions. It's about a moment in time, a courtroom decision, a family reaction, and what release actually means in a high-profile case that is still unfolding. According to publicly available records, Timothy Busfield has been released from custody under strict conditions, and the details behind that decision raise important questions about how the justice system balances procedure, rights, and responsibility, especially when emotions are running high. Stay with this because what happened after the ruling reveals more than the ruling itself. On Tuesday, January 20th, according to online court records reviewed by People, actor Timothy Busfield was released from the Metropolitan Detention Center in Bernalillo County, New Mexico. This came after a 2-hour pretrial detention hearing, a proceeding focused not on guilt or innocence, but on whether he should remain in custody while awaiting trial. The judge ultimately ruled that Busfield would be released on his own recognizance with specific conditions in place. This distinction matters. Release under these terms does not indicate a resolution of the case. It does not signal an outcome. It simply reflects the court's determination that, under the standards required at this stage, detention was not legally justified. And that legal nuance is where many public misunderstandings begin. Pretrial detention hearings operate under a very specific framework. The court does not weigh full evidence the way a jury eventually might. Instead, it evaluates whether the state has met a high legal threshold, whether there are no conditions that could reasonably ensure public safety and court compliance. In this case, the judge stated that the state had not met that burden, citing Busfield's voluntary surrender and compliance with court orders. This is procedural, not personal. It is about standards of proof at a preliminary stage, not about conclusions regarding the allegations themselves, and that distinction often gets lost in headlines. As the ruling was announced, Melissa Gilbert was present in the courtroom, accompanied by close family members. According to reports, she became emotional following the judge's decision, quietly expressing gratitude as the outcome was read. Her reaction was not framed as commentary on the case itself, but as relief that her husband would be able to return home while the process continues. Shortly after, Busfield's civil attorney told People that his client feels wonderful following the ruling, emphasizing that he could now reunite with his wife. Gilbert, according to the same source, was described as very, very excited. These are human reactions, not legal arguments, and that difference is important. Melissa Gilbert's support for her husband has been consistent and public. On the day charges were announced, her representative issued a statement saying that she stands with and supports him. Days later, she was among dozens of individuals who submitted a letter opposing the state's request for pretrial detention. In that letter, she expressed admiration for her husband and asked the court to take care of him. Support letters like these are not uncommon in legal proceedings. They are considered character statements, personal perspectives offered to the court, but not evidence addressing the allegations themselves. Still, their visibility can amplify public reaction, especially when the individuals involved are well known. And that reaction has been intense. According to prosecutors, Busfield has been charged with multiple offenses involving minors. The identities of the alleged victims have not been made public, and the case remains ongoing. Busfield has denied the allegations. Before turning himself in, he stated publicly that he did not commit the acts described and that he intends to contest the charges through the legal process. At this stage, these remain allegations, and the presumption of innocence applies under the law. At the same time, the seriousness of the charges has led to strict conditions being placed on his release, conditions designed to limit risk while the case proceeds. The court imposed several requirements that Busfield must follow while awaiting trial. These include mandatory court appearances, restrictions on contact with certain individuals, limitations on travel oversight, and prohibitions related to substances and weapons. Such conditions are not punitive, they are preventative. They exist to maintain structure, oversight, and accountability during an unresolved case. The judge emphasized compliance and supervision, not freedom without boundaries. And this is where the story becomes more complex, because release does not mean relief from consequences, it means a different kind of waiting. On one side, a family expressing relief and unity. On the other, a legal process that has only just begun. This contrast, emotional response versus procedural reality, is what makes this case so closely followed. Public attention often focuses on visible moments, a courtroom reaction, a quote, a headline. But the legal timeline stretches far beyond those snapshots, and what happens next will likely redefine how this moment is remembered. When news breaks that someone has been released from custody, public reaction can be immediate and often polarized. But legally, release is not a reward, and detention is not a verdict. In the U.S. justice system, pretrial detention is considered an exception, not a default. Courts are required to assess whether conditions short of detention can reasonably ensure compliance and safety. In this case, the judge explicitly referenced Busfield's decision to surrender voluntarily and submit himself to the court's authority. That action was cited as evidence of compliance, not character, not credibility, but conduct within the legal process. This distinction is subtle but crucial, and it explains why two people can look at the same ruling and walk away with very different interpretations. Much of what the public knows about this case comes from warrants, court filings, and limited statements released through media outlets. These documents are informative but incomplete by design. They outline allegations, procedural steps, and judicial reasoning, not full narratives. They do not include every testimony, every context, or every unanswered question, and they certainly do not predict outcomes. This is why responsible reporting relies on phrases like, according to court records or as stated in filings, language that reflects the limits of what is known at this stage. It's also why speculation can quickly outrun facts. Melissa Gilbert's emotional response in the courtroom quickly became one of the most discussed aspects of the story. Not because it affected the ruling, it didn't, but because it humanized the moment. For some viewers, her reaction represented loyalty and relief. For others, it raised difficult emotional questions about proximity, belief, and perspective. But legally speaking, her reaction holds no bearing on the case itself. It exists in a separate space, the personal space, which often collides with public narratives when high-profile figures are involved, and that collision is rarely comfortable. The letter signed by Gilbert and others opposing pretrial detention has also drawn attention. To understand its role, it's important to separate influence from perception. Support letters are considered during detention decisions, but they are weighed alongside risk assessments, legal standards, and procedural history. They do not override statutory requirements. Their real impact is often symbolic, illustrating community ties or personal relationships, rather than determinative. Yet publicly, these letters can appear far more powerful than they actually are within the legal framework. This gap between perception and function is another reason why cases like this generate ongoing debate. While headlines focus on release, the conditions attached to that release quietly shape everyday reality. Supervision by pretrial services, limitations on contact, behavioral restrictions. These are not minor details. They dictate movement, communication, and routine. They also serve as a constant reminder that the case is active and unresolved. For families, this creates a unique emotional environment, relief mixed with uncertainty, closeness paired with constraint. It's not freedom as most people understand it. It's conditional normalcy, and that distinction often gets overlooked. Before surrendering to authorities, Busfield stated publicly that he denied the allegations and intended to contest them. That statement continues to frame how his legal team approaches the case, emphasizing denial, process, and defense rather than commentary. At this stage, that approach is expected. Defendants are not required to prove innocence in pretrial proceedings, nor are they expected to present full defenses publicly. What matters now is preparation, compliance, and patience. And patience in cases like this is often the hardest part. High-profile cases often feel frozen around singular moments, an arrest, a hearing, a release. But legally, those moments are milestones, not destinations. The real weight of the case will unfold over time, through motions, hearings, evidentiary arguments, and eventually a trial unless resolved earlier. What seems definitive today may feel procedural tomorrow, and that's why understanding where a case sits on the timeline matters more than reacting to any one development. For now, the situation is defined by waiting. Waiting for court dates, waiting for arguments to be filed, waiting for clarity that cannot yet be responsibly offered. This pause between action and outcome is where most public confusion lives. And it's also where the next chapter of this story quietly begins. When a legal case involves recognizable names, the courtroom is no longer the only place where pressure exists. Public attention adds a parallel layer, one that neither side formally controls, but both must navigate. For Timothy Busfield and Melissa Gilbert, this means that routine procedural steps are interpreted, analyzed, and often emotionally charged in the public space. A filing becomes a headline. A ruling becomes a talking point. And yet, inside the legal system, the pace remains methodical and restrained. This disconnect between public urgency and judicial tempo often fuels misunderstanding. In cases like this, observers often ask why there aren't more statements, interviews, or clarifications. But legally, restraint is often intentional. Attorneys generally limit public commentary to avoid influencing proceedings, mischaracterizing facts, or creating statements that could later be scrutinized in court. That's why most updates come through filings and official rulings rather than personal explanations. Silence in this context is not avoidance, it's caution, and it's likely to continue. While the case moves forward, daily life continues under structure and supervision. Release conditions require constant awareness, where someone can go, who they can contact, what they must avoid, and when they must report. For families, this creates an emotional paradox: closeness without closure. Melissa Gilbert's public relief reflects one side of that experience. The unresolved nature of the case reflects the other. Both exist at the same time, and neither cancels the other out. Judges are trained to separate reaction from requirement. Emotion, public opinion, and media attention are acknowledged realities. But they are not legal standards. What matters is compliance, risk assessment, and adherence to constitutional principles. That's why the judge's comments focused on surrender, jurisdiction, and evidentiary thresholds, not on public sentiment. It's also why future decisions may look very different from this one, depending on what unfolds next. Consistency in process does not guarantee consistency in outcome. At this stage, many critical elements remain outside public view. Evidence has not been fully examined in open court. Witness testimony has not been presented to a jury. Legal arguments are still being prepared. This absence of information can feel unsettling, especially in cases involving serious allegations. But it is also a safeguard designed to protect fairness on all sides. Understanding that gap is essential to understanding the story as a whole. Even without an outcome, certain moments become symbolic. A courtroom reaction, a judge's phrasing, a release order with strict conditions. These moments shape public memory long before a final determination is reached. And depending on what happens next, they may later be seen as either transitional or defining. That uncertainty is what keeps attention focused. As the case progresses, the focus will inevitably shift from procedure to substance. Future hearings will carry different stakes. Arguments will become more detailed. The margin for interpretation will narrow. For now, however, the story remains one of process, not proof, and recognizing that difference is key to following what comes next responsibly. Beyond the individuals involved, this situation highlights a broader reality about how the justice system operates under public scrutiny. High-profile cases often become emotional mirrors. People project beliefs, fears, and expectations onto partial information, sometimes without realizing how limited that information is. This case, in particular, shows how one procedural decision can be interpreted as many different things at once: relief for a family, frustration for observers, and simply routine legal application for the court. None of those interpretations are inherently wrong, but none of them replace the legal process itself. One common misconception is that accountability only begins after a verdict. In reality, accountability exists throughout the process. Court supervision, mandatory appearances, behavioral restrictions. These are active forms of oversight, not pauses in responsibility. At the same time, outcome remains undecided. This dual reality, accountability without conclusion, is uncomfortable but intentional. It reflects a system designed to balance individual rights with public safety while facts are still being examined. Understanding this balance helps explain why cases like this unfold slowly, deliberately, and often quietly. The way a story is framed early can influence how it is remembered later. Initial headlines often emphasize emotion or immediacy. Later updates tend to focus on technical details. By the time a final resolution arrives, public attention may have already shifted, leaving early impressions frozen in time. That's why context matters now, not just later, because today's interpretation becomes tomorrow's memory. As of now, Timothy Busfield remains released under court-imposed conditions while awaiting further proceedings. Melissa Gilbert has publicly expressed relief and support, while the legal process continues independently of those emotions. No verdict has been reached, no final determination has been made. What exists instead is structure, supervision, and an open legal timeline. And that timeline is still moving. This moment is not an ending. It's a checkpoint. It offers insight into how pretrial decisions work, how families experience legal uncertainty, and how public narratives form long before outcomes are known. The next phase of this case will bring different questions. How evidence is evaluated, how arguments are tested, and how process eventually leads to resolution. If you want to understand that stage, not through speculation but through context and clarity, that's where the story continues.